So here we are back in history class. One of the things we'll see in the next couple of weeks as we study the Greeks is how many aspects of their culture we can look around today and we can see in our culture. There are lots of things the Greeks did that are worth imitating. And there's lots of things that they did that are not worth imitating. You never know what's going to get passed down through the ages. So it's really important how we live now. The world's reaction to the coronavirus will certainly go down in history, and we want our reaction to be a faithful one, a reaction that is thankful and joyful. So here we go. In the year 2020, humanity was threatened with extinction. Panic spread over the planet like never before. What were you doing, Grandpa? Just sending memes to friends and stuff. So I thought I would share with you all a couple of my favorite memes that I've seen recently. I'm sure you've probably seen several from maybe your family. And here's a couple I've seen floating around that tickled my funny bone. If you're wondering what's happening to all the toilet paper, here you go. And then I thought this was quite funny with the keeping away from everybody. Sasquatches can be our example. All right, so Greece. We have already seen that the Greeks were unusual among all the peoples of the ancient world because they weren't like a single tribe or racial entity. They came to the Greek Isles, some 6,000 islands scattered through the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean, and a rocky little peninsula at the bottom of the Balkans, which is a mountainous region. And between the peninsula and the 6,000 islands, all that together is a landmass that totals about 50,000 square miles, which is about the same size as Alabama. And it has a population, it had a population of around 1 million all across Greece during the Golden Age. And that would kind of be comparative to, say, like the population, maybe a little bit less, of Portland, Oregon. So anyway, all these people, over the course really of several centuries, from Europe and from Asia and from North Africa, and they moved together and formed a civilization that became ancient Greece. They developed a unified language and a largely unified culture. They had close trade relations between one another, but politically these various migrations formed around a series of city-states. And these city-states were independent of each other politically, although they did enter into alliances with one another. And you can kind of see some of the main ones here. And if you have your hard copy of this map handy, you can see it a little more clearly than you can on the screen probably. But you've got Sparta down there in the bottom of the Peloponnese. And you see Corinth right up there in the top of the Peloponnese, right above Mycenae. And Olympia was probably not one of the most important ones, but I put it on there just because we always think of that when we think of Greece and the Olympics that are, of course, still going on today. And then if you look a little bit further north of the Peloponnese, you'll see Delphi, which y'all probably remember from when we've talked about the oracle at Delphi and the different people that went there to get advice. Sometimes was helpful and sometimes not so much. If you look just above Delphi, you'll see Thermopylae, where, of course, the battle took place there with the Persians and the 300 Spartans there at the end of the battle. Slightly to the southeast of that, you'll see Thebes, and below that, you'll see Marathon, which was also not a hugely influential city-state, but it's since we've already talked about it, I thought it's nice to kind of identify it on the map. And then right below that is Athens. And then you'll see down, in Crete, there's Knossos. Let's see what else is on this picture. Oh, Troy. Look right there in Asia Minor, up in the top right-hand corner of your map. And you'll see Troy. But anyway, that's where some of those city-states that we're going to talk about today are located. But during the golden age of Greece, there were 42 separate and independent city-states. These are just a handful of the most prominent ones. And the greatest of these, of course, was Athens. At the height of its growth and power prior to the Peloponnesian War, Athens had a population of around 300,000 people. So think a little bit larger than Boise. It was the largest city-state, and the only city-state that came close to it was Syracuse, which had about 250,000. Syracuse, which was one of the colonies of Athens, together with Athens, they comprised almost half of the total population of Greece. So Athens was hugely important. It dominated the whole culture in Greece, and as a result, it controlled all the best seaports and access to the relatively calm seas of the Aegean and the trade with all the islands that surrounded it in the Aegean Sea, some 6,000 islands. Now, when we say 6,000 islands, it's important to remember that today, only about 278 of those were inhabited, are inhabited, and only about 70 of those 278 have populations of more than 100. So they're tiny little islands that are scattered around the Aegean, and there's very few people there. But it's one of the most beautiful places on the face of the earth. The Balkans are largely limestone, which means the stone is white, and the Aegean Sea is a crystalline blue. So when you look at the Greek Isles, you see these white rocky islands with little caps of green, vineyards or olive trees, and this just stunningly deep, deep blue. So as a result, the Athenians, with their deep water ports and with their access to the sea at every corner and all these just gorgeous islands all around, they were really drawn to the sea from the earliest days. And Athens became a great naval power. While we know that Athens largely from their art and from their philosophy, these things were really only made possible by there being so much leisure time brought about by the prosperity that they found by trading as they went to sea. Athens became a commercial center and a very, very profitable trading center. And this was based upon their naval power and their commitment to the sea. So Athens is like this powerful place. It's the most powerful in the whole region. And this brought about what's referred to as the Golden Age of Pericles. And Pericles was this great orator whom Plutarch described as being the greatest general and the most masterful politician of the age. This was around 440 BC. And so about 30 years after the end of the Persian War. And we're going to talk about him some more in the future. But Athens, because of its trading alliances and its trade partnerships, as well as its concern about the Persians, they put together a kind of defensive league that was called the Delian League. And this was a symbol of it. And Athens became the leading city, and of course, so it became the dominant leader of the Delian League. And in time, once the Persians weren't really the main focus, and weren't as much of a threat, the Delian League became more of a political alliance, and it created a vast trading network that reached all the way across the whole Mediterranean. So, in other words, Athens became an empire all its own. And even though it didn't have the same kind of imperial structure as, say, like the Egyptians or the Babylonians or the Persians, it became an empire nevertheless. And the Athenians, even though they didn't have armies that went out and conquered territories, they didn't enslave the masses like you see with like the Assyrians. Most of the colonies remained somewhat independent, but still, Athens really was an empire. And Sparta, of course, was a really important city-state. It was a much smaller city, and of course, it had a very different culture. It was landlocked. They didn't look out to the sea. They were rooted primarily in farming, and they were best known for their military. As you already know, Sparta actually organized their entire city, their entire culture around the training of young men to be warriors. Every Spartan boy was taught to fight. From the earliest age, they were taught that the highest virtue that any Spartan could have was loyalty and brutality on the battlefield. The Spartans, of course, were fierce warriors. At its height, there were about 25,000 people there, so a little tiny bit smaller than Moscow. Athens was 10 times larger, but Sparta was able to defeat Athens again and again and again because the entire culture revolved around the military. The great Leonidas that we've already talked about, the king of Sparta who led and fought at the Battle of Thermopylae with the 300, was in a sense the great kind of iconic figure of Sparta. And this is a statue of him. Sparta naturally opposed the pretensions and the presumptions of Athens. The Spartans believed that the Athenians were soft, that they were corrupted by all their money and their prissy lifestyle with theater and an emphasis on food and festivals. They basically thought they were just a bunch of wimps. I thought about this and I thought this is pretty much the attitude of the Spartans when it came to the Athenians. They're just like, please. They danced around in their Dionysian festivals and drank their pitiful wine, and they had their pitiful parties while the Spartans were busy training, preparing for danger. And as a result, the Spartans constantly opposed everything that the Athenians did. So one of the things that they did in opposition to the Athenians was to form their own league. When the Delian League of the Athenians grew to be so powerful and influential, and it began to bring into its orbit a whole host of other city-states throughout Greece, Sparta formed what it called the Peloponnesian League to really keep in check the aspirations of the Athenians, and in their minds to restore the glory and dignity of what it meant to be Greek, which in the Spartan mind was a much more militaristic view or picture. This, of course, led to a series of civil wars, including one absolutely devastating civil war, the Peloponnesian War. Lasted 30 years, and when it was over, Athens was destroyed, but sadly for them, the Greek civilization was destroyed as well, and it never really recovered after that. Athens was never again a commercial or naval power. After the Peloponnesian War, Greece was governed by one tyrant after another. If it wasn't Alexander the Great, it was the generals that followed Alexander. If it wasn't them, it was the Romans. After the Romans, the Ottoman Turks came in. And one after another, the Greeks were ruled by tyrants, and never again gained a ascendancy. And because Sparta knocked Athens off its perch, and all that was kind of the end of that. If you remember from Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue in Daniel 2, that this had been prophesied, that this was going to happen, and that Greece would not remain powerful. So then there's the city-state of Thebes. Thebes has perhaps been the greatest of all the Greek city-states, or had been until the rise of Athens. It figures really prominently in a lot of the mythology of ancient Greece. It's one of the cities that comes up again and again in lots of the stories of Odysseus and the Iliad, and all the way across the board until you start, hearing about the great plays of Oedipus and Aeschylus and Sophocles. I thought I would play you just a little quick nutshell version of one of Aeschylus's stories, Greek mythologies, about Prometheus. And you all may already be familiar with this.
Meet Prometheus, the god of forethought, the fire-bringer. Wise, crafty, and friend of mortals. Entrusted with creating humans, Prometheus molds mankind from clay, shaping them 2 legs so that they mirror the appearance of the gods. And for years, the gods live at peace with men. One day, a great banquet is held. Prometheus, a trickster at heart, prepares 2 portions. He fills an ox's stomach with tender meats and covers the gristle and bones with juicy fats. Zeus, mouth watering from the succulent smells, greedily seizes the fat and begins to feast. When he discovers he has a plate full of bones, he flies into a rage and seizes the gift of fire from humans. Yet Prometheus, undeterred, steals the fire from heaven and returns it to earth, hiding it in the stalk of a fennel plant. Zeus, furious, swears terrible revenge. He orders Prometheus bound naked to a cliff, and each day sends an eagle to tear open his stomach and devour his liver. And so, for generations, Prometheus is punished.
And so there is the very brief and dark story of Prometheus. Um, so Thebes, Thebes is one of those great cities that seems to be larger in literature actually than it even was in real life. But it was a place where the philosophy of Socrates took root far more profoundly than in Socrates' own hometown of Athens. And we'll talk more about that. But Thebes also had ended up putting itself in kind of an awkward place. It sought to broker power against both the Athenians and the Spartans, and to play a bit of a middleman, which ended up that Thebes found itself in a great tug of war, and it was caught in the middle in the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. So then we come to Corinth. I bet you will notice in this picture the columns that we've already talked about some. So Corinthian columns, right, were much more ornate than the Doric ones and the Ionic ones. Corinth was another of the great city states of Greece, and it actually became even greater during the Roman age than it was really during the time that Greece was more powerful. Um, During the Roman age, it becomes a provincial capital for the Romans, and we primarily, of course, know about it because of the New Testament. But Corinth was down at the Peloponnese, and it was a commercial city that's not very far from Sparta. Here you can see Corinth right there in the northern bit of the Peloponnese, and and then you can see several other cities you probably recognize: Thessalonica, Philippi, up in the north there, Ephesus over in the east in Asia Minor. All places that you can think of when you think of all those epistles from Paul in the New Testament. And so Corinth was one of those cities that he visited. But Corinth also found itself often allied with Athens, but at times swinging into the sway of Sparta for a time, and so it kind of went back and forth depending on different circumstances who it aligned itself with. But it was a center for philosophy and trade, just like Athens. And then the last of the major city states we're going to look at is Syracuse. And the funny thing about Syracuse is that it's not even in Greece. it's significantly over there, further to the west, right off the boot of Italy. It may have been the greatest of all the Greek city states, despite reputation and power and the wealth of Athens. It was a colony planted by Athens on the island of Sicily. And here's a little close up for you. And it grew to be this really large, just opulent, powerful city that was in the center of the Mediterranean. It was largely known as a place where people who got into trouble in the city states back home in Greece would make their way for exile. And so they wound up with all kinds of exiles there. Often they were some of the most gifted and most creative of all the people from the other city states. And it was here that, for instance, that both Aristotle and Plato went temporarily when they were sent on a short hiatus, or when they were exiled politically. But the result was that this Sicilian city became very, very powerful in the areas of trade and science, philosophy and art, music and literature. If an architect couldn't get something built in Athens because of a corrupt infrastructure there, or because they were opposed politically, he could go and ply his trade in Sicily in the city of Syracuse. The result was that Syracuse had the best theaters, had the best Acropolis, the most remarkable public works system of sewers and running water, and amazingly, I can't believe this, but they actually had naturally air-conditioned buildings. This was one of the great feats, although it was duplicated in a couple of other palaces, like in ancient Babylon. There were some places, and we think perhaps in Assyria, though that's not been confirmed by archaeologists. But they had these large water cooling systems, and with large water towers and underground pools that were vented, and it would bring cool air into a number of the public buildings throughout Syracuse, and it made Syracuse this luxury destination. Sailors who wanted to take a long leave before returning back to their responsibilities in Athens or Thebes would come to Syracuse, and it was this just remarkable city. Anyway, so that is just a little glimpse of of some of the most important city-states in Greece. There is a review sheet that you have that has each of the city-states on there with some blanks. And so those you want to fill in. I'm going to send you, or I have already sent you at this point, when you're hearing this, I have sent you notes that went with this lecture. And so you can look back over those too to help you fill in some of the most important facts about each of these city-states. But before we go, I want us to pray together. Lord, thank you for the fact that we can look back at history and see lessons for our own time more clearly. I pray for these students that you would enable them to think in terms of what has been so that they can live now in terms of what is right and good and true. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll talk to y'all soon. Bye.